Hello, everyone. I'm glad you joined me for this particular sermon or sermonette. I'm going to be talking to you about walking with God from Genesis chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. Enoch is a bit of a mystery in the Bible. We do know who his father was because in chapter 5 we have the lineage of Seth, and we know that Enoch was the seventh down from Seth in that lineage. We also know who his son was and who his great-grandson was. His son was Methuselah, and his great-grandson was Noah. So we know all those parts about him and just the little snippets that we have in that genealogy about him personally. But they are mysterious. It says in two places that Enoch walked with God. And in verse 24, it tells us that Enoch walked with God for 300 years, and then he was not seen, for he was taken by the Lord. And that is an enigmatic statement. The writer of Hebrews would key into that in chapter 11 and talk about the faith of Enoch. He would interpret that concept of walking with God as the fact that Enoch pleased God, and he would say that it is impossible to please God unless we are people of faith. And so people of faith are those who walk with God in the writer of Hebrews thought process. So if we walk with God, we are people of faith. There are a handful of men in the Old Testament who are said to walk with God. Those men are intriguing to us. Adam and Eve, in the beginning of creation, it says, walked in the garden with God, but after the fall, there's no indication that they ever walked again with God. We have the man Abraham, who walks with God and is called the friend of God in the Old Testament. We have Moses, whom God identifies as being very close to him and walking with him. We also have the man Elijah, the prophet Elijah, who walks with God. All of these people in the Old Testament are said to walk with God. It meant something very special and very unique in the Old Testament. It meant that you had a personal relationship, a close personal friendship with God, that he treated you as a companion, as a friend. Such an unusual thing. Moses would be so close to God that when he was preparing for death, he would go up to the top of Mount Nebo, and it says there when he died, the Lord buried him privately. It was a very personal and intimate relationship between Moses and God. For Elijah, he would be separated from his companion Elisha by a chariot of fire, and then suddenly a whirlwind would whisk him up out of Elisha's sight into the presence of God. In Enoch's case, it simply says he walked with God one day and he was taken. Those are interesting statements about these particular people. When we think about what it means to walk with God, it means something very special and unique in our lives. When I was thinking about this particular message, I was looking at Ephesians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 8. And one of the statements that the Apostle Paul makes there is, conduct yourself in this world as a child of God. Conduct yourself in this world as a child of God. If we are to walk with God, we must first conduct ourselves as children of God in this world. We must do so by developing some important things. The writer of Ephesians in chapter 5 says we need to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit in our lives: joy, peace, patience, all of those things that are a part of the fruit of the Spirit of God, to love and care, to be men and women of our word. All of these are characteristics that people who are children of God should encourage in our lives. The fruit of the Spirit is found in Galatians chapter 5, beginning in verse 22, and I recommend you look that up. He also told us in that passage that we need to develop a reputation for being good people. That means that we look about us and do good. It also means that we are righteous people, that we are concerned about what is right in the world, and that we are truthful people. Those kinds of things are characteristics of God's children. If we are to walk with Him, we need to be intentionally developing these characteristics in our lives. He also says that we need to discover what pleases God in the process of living. And for the other 4 principles that come out of this passage, you'll have to come and hear my sermon, either on the internet or you'll have to come to church to hear it. But there are 7 principles that Paul lays down for us if we are to walk with God in our lives. The first years of the 1800s saw something remarkable happen. A book that we had known about in ancient times was rediscovered in the late 1700s. It was discovered by an erstwhile explorer who went to Ethiopia. He was kind of full of himself because he proclaimed that he had discovered the headwaters of the Nile, when actually there had been an explorer in the 1600s that had actually gone to the headwaters of the Nile. But there he came into contact with the Ethiopian Coptic Church, and he came to possess a manuscript of the book of Enoch. Actually, it was 4 books that were attributed to Enoch. It was part of the Ethiopian Coptic Church's sacred literature. It had been lost to Western culture for, well, nearly 1,000 years or more. It was intriguing that it should be found there and brought to England. They began translating it in the first decade, and it really transformed biblical studies and our understanding of apocalyptic literature. It had been known about because it's been mentioned in many Christian writers and by many Jewish writers from the early centuries. But after the destruction of the temple, it fell out of use and was actually downplayed by the rabbinic authorities, and so it never made its way into the scripture of the Western Church. And there's good reason. If you read it, you'll understand. It's not what I would consider scripture, but it is fascinating to read. In that literature, which was available in the first century because it was written originally about 300 years before the time of Christ, they believe, and it impacted the world in which the Christians in the first century lived and understood the world in. In fact, it's quoted in the New Testament in the book of Jude, and it is alluded to by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2, and it is also alluded to in the book of Jude as well, to some of the events in that particular book. It is intriguing to watch the man Enoch if you read it. He is a man who is considered tremendously righteous, and It follows along with the or uh, expands on the information that we have in Genesis chapter 5 and in Genesis chapter 6. Enoch is actually asked by the watchers, or the ones, or the fallen angels as they are identified in the book of Enoch, and they're likely called the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6. But they are those who are fallen, and they basically come to Enoch and ask him if he will intercede with God because of his close relationship with God. So by the time of the first century, Enoch is considered a unique and different man. He is a special man of righteousness and goodness. I thought about how important this concept of righteousness was. A song that has always touched my heart has been a song that is Just a Closer Walk with Thee. It's interesting in that it was a spiritual that came out of possibly the slave era of American history. But it was not really rediscovered until the 1940s, when a man by the name of Kenneth Morris went to Kansas City, where a friend of his had heard this particular song sung in a church there. And he visited with the choir leader to find out about this song. And the choir leader said, well, I've been singing this since I was a child. This is something I grew up with. And Kenneth Morris did a long interview with this particular man. And then he scored the song, and it became the first publication of his and a lady by the name of Sally Martin's publishing company. That publishing company was the Martin Morris Publishing Company. It was the first wholly owned African American publishing company in the United States, and also one of the longest running ones and the most successful of them. Morris's hymn caught on immediately, and publishers from larger publishing houses came to him and asked for the right to publish it in their hymnals, and it became a stunning success almost immediately, and raised the profile of this particular publishing company. The two leaders were members of the Holiness and Pentecostal church movement of the mid 20th century. They had a strong sense of what it meant to follow Christ, a strong sense of what it meant to be a Christian and to serve Christ, to walk with God in our lives. So Just a Closer Walk with Thee was a plea for holiness. It also was a fascinating song in the things that it changed. It would have a dramatic impact on other forms of music that were developing at that time. One of them was rock and roll. If you're interested in that music history, I encourage you to look it up. But it was transformative for us as Christians. The song was based to some extent on 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 through 9. So we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in this body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Therefore, we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well pleasing to Him. And I hope that's your goal this day, to be pleasing to the Lord, to walk with Him. God bless. Have a wonderful day.